Hey everybody, this is AAA Radio where we bring our A team of adolescents with their A game.
I
This is a
don't
book discussion
that's it.
podcast where we read spicy books in advance and discuss what we thought of them. This week we're discussing The Hobbit, a famous novel by J.R.R. Tolkien and the precursor to The Lord of the Rings. Both of these book series are among the greatest fantasy books of all time, so if you haven't read them yet, we definitely recommend that you read them. This podcast will contain spoilers, so if you want to follow along or have a better idea of what we're talking about, you may wish to read the book in advance. Now, The Hobbit is a tale of Bilbo Baggins, your average everyday hobbit, who becomes intertwined in an adventure to reclaim a party of dwarves' stolen gold. And so let us begin. First of
Uh,
all, what do you guys think of the book?
Hold on, non sequitur time. Did you say adolescent? I mean, it's not like you're not allowed to put the emphasis on wherever you want the syllable, but just I might have to resign after this. I'm sorry. Well, the book was a nice book, very good book. I liked it.
Right. What do you
Singing,
like about it specifically? Anything in particular?
the narrative structure where the narrator tells you everything makes it reminiscent of like the children's storybook, which is the original purpose of it, right? He wrote it for his grandchildren.
Yep. Yeah.
One of
Tolkien initially ended up writing this book to read to his children at bedtime.
Yeah, it was for Spawn. That's why the narrator is what's it called? An integral part of it. Reads nicely. There's a lot of parts where it's just like the musical sections. I like the flow. Like everyone has songs, and it's very thematically clear. I guess. Like you can tell the people are good or people are bad immediately off the bat. It's like, hey, look, the goblins, they build big machines to murder people. These are the bad guys, guys. Look, the elves like nature. They're good people, but they're also like, everyone's kind of mean, except for maybe the hobbits.
That's
It,
very
it,
true.
yeah, it's good that it's pretty like defined. It's easy to follow, so I guess it makes it more available to a wider audience too.
Very digestible and child friendly.
Yeah, I felt like the simpler language made it a lot more engaging and easier to follow. I really enjoyed like the imagery and like this descriptions of like the location and the surrounding that he would give us. Like I was a big fan of that.
Yeah, I also enjoyed the imagery part of it because Tolkien, I feel like, in putting his own sort of pretty unique spin to the narrative voice, he went super deep into the lore of everything, and that sort of helped build the world a lot for me as well. I think because now you pretty much already just from the book alone, even though The Hobbit doesn't go as much into the lore as The Lord of the Rings, you can pretty much already tell that this is a well-crafted world with its own policies, and then you get hints of how the world works and how the interactions between the different races and the different groups of people, how they function.
Yeah, I think that was very well described, like the interactions and also almost the economic side of it, like how different areas within the book will interact and how each end will affect each other.
That worked out very well. In describing the narrative tone as well, the narrative tone, what do you think it was most similar to? Obviously, it was of the narrative tone of a father talking to his child in a sense. But did you guys feel that it was also sort of this omniscient vibe, as in the narrator is an all omniscient person who knows about the story rather than experiencing it along with us in the first place? Did you guys feel that that was the case?
I think the canon explanation the meta explanation for why these books exist is that they were real things that happened, but Tolkien just found it and translated it to English, which is why it sounds like he's sort of someone who already knew everything that's going to happen because it's canonically, it's a story that's already happened. It's being rewritten for an audience. It's been recorded down by like the elves or something.
Yeah, I agree with that. It seems like the narrator would already know what is happening, and oftentimes the narrator alludes to things that will happen in the future, which really shows his omniscience of the matter.
Yeah, it's times like, don't worry, guys. Gandalf did know about it, or Bilbo was very unhappy, but X is going to happen in the future, so it's going to be even less happy. Haha, suffer, Bilbo. I mean, looking back in this, Lord of the Rings is the fantasy genre defining books. I feel like a lot of later copies, thanks to the powerful imagery, copy the aesthetics of Lord of the Rings, but don't go in on the themes. Like, first off, like basically everyone, basically just except from like maybe Dungeons and Dragons, removes the Hobbit entirely because hobbits aren't cool. I guess small, fluffy people who are quiet aren't the most interesting wizards, I suppose. It's like, hey guys, dwarves make things. Oh, they're legendary smiths, and they're Scottish or something now, guys. Why not? And elves, they're noble and tall and immortal. They're so cool. The thing is, elves are really childish and vindictive in the book. They clearly have the powers to do a lot. They've done things in the past, so they spend their times hiding away and what's it called? Just eating food while the rest of the world is on fire. The dwarves are decent. They're never described as good people. They're craftsmen, but they aren't obsessed with making the best things. And it's mentioned they make the best things, but they don't make like giant war machines or god tier weapons. They're just good smiths. The ones that are actually the best crafters in the book are the goblins, arguably, because they make war machines and apocalyptic destruction devices.
That is pretty true. If the world was more similar to ours, it's entirely possible that the goblins might have ultimately ended up dominating and taking over everything.
The thing is, like, the goblins, that's what they did. They make war machines, but they're not fighters. So they don't actually, probably aren't the ones who use them.
Oh, that's interesting, given
They
that what
might have
happened
used
later
them,
in the
but
series.
like the goblin fights don't describe massive catapults or sky ships or anything.
But I feel like you do have a point there with the whole how this ended up introducing flaws and nuances to the characters of the various races, rather than just being like, oh, dwarves are excellent smiths, elves are good at magic,
And we
hobbits
can
don't
see it in their
exist.
songs. There's not much hobbits in the Hobbit, ironically, but like the songs of dwarves are always about money or stuff. The glories of the past days are forever nostalgic about time they're all rich and powerful. They're
Yeah,
like
the
the
songs really do
boomers.
a great
They're
job at
literally
showing the
magical
motivation.
boomers. The elves sing mostly about nonsense, like when they taunted the elf. Oh no, Bilbo's ate too many cakes and is too fat to fit through a hole anymore. They're very childish. The only race that's arguably as childish is the hobbits, but the hobbits are less childish fans that they're very pragmatic. They like eating, sleeping, and not doing stuff. Very simple folk. And that concept of the ordinary hero gets kind of lost because in almost every other story, it's like, oh, look, the guy's a loser and nobody at the start. The guy ends up being super cool or powerful, but Bilbo
doesn't change.
get super cool or powerful. Yeah, he just gets more competent. I mean, he gets a chosen ring and he has help from Gandalf, who's arguably a Jesus figure, depending on how much you look into it. He's a white old man with 12 followers and 13 doors. One of them has 12 followers and he rises from the dead. But like even his sword isn't special. Orcsist and Glamdring are named immediately after brought to the Elf King, but Sting is named by Bilbo himself. And although it's an elven short sword, it's not a magical legendary god killer weapon. It uses to literally just kill bugs. There's also the concept of what's it called? Normally the story like ends at the climax, right? Once you beat the dragon and you get the gold, the story ends there. If you get to the love interest, story ends there. But Smaug isn't much of a villain in The Hobbit, and I think that's something that's lost in a lot of contemporary fantasy.
What do you think the real villain is then?
He's built up as a huge boss, and he gets shot by some guy. Wow, big boss fight, very epic.
Yeah, but I feel like the whole thing about him being built up as this massive villain, the end all, the world ender, and then just being destroyed by a single arrow was kind of thematic and purposeful, because it was like this whole theme of like his confidence, his arrogance ended up making him believe that he was all powerful. Then he was just as weak as the rest of everyone else. Without his gold armor. Yeah,
The Hobbit has a ton of powerful themes in it, but they're really lost in modern fantasy. People will just end the story with everyone beat the gold and it becomes friendly. The Hobbit takes chances once you get the gold. Well, everyone wants the gold now, don't they? And the thing that takes the most lives is nothing on the journey but the battle after they've won the loot, which is a bit ironic. Greed was the enemy the whole time. So I was going to say, it's like for a story where greed, like when the bad guy makes machines and the dragon's literally called smog, it's probably an allusion to technological advancement in the Industrial Revolution.
Well, the thing is, Tolkien pretty deliberately said in a number of interviews that he did not mean for his book to allude to anything in particular.
Yeah,
But you can consider that it may have been influenced to some degree
because
by
he also
real life happenings.
Someone who likes nature and has some distaste for the.
But then, even the whole theme, that whole idea of nature versus industrialization, that's sort of reflected. It's not like nature is particularly portrayed as this great force
Not
either. 'Cause if you think about it, the elves are supposed to react to be one with nature, to be part of nature. Now, there's multiple forms of elves in the book, like the elves near the Lost Homely Home. Those elves are fun-loving and cheerful, but then there's also the elves in Mirkwood, who, despite being part of nature, they've almost become like a corrupted version of the other elves. And it's this whole idea of that, that this greed and corruption can corrupt even nature itself, rather than just coming on as a result of industrialization or invented things.
And to talk ill of nature, that's not to mention Mirkwood itself, which is dark, awful, and full of giant murder spiders. Right?
Yeah, it's this idea that even the most elemental of things in the world can become easily corrupted by greed or by the effects of greed or industrialization.
Nothing is that good, but I think the way that it's like, if you don't disturb something, it's not going to hurt you. As I suppose another thing. Smog took the gold, but Smog would have been happy just sitting there for a couple hundred years. The Mirkwood's dangerous. It's not like the spiders leave the woods. The benevolence of nature doesn't leave there either. It's like the elves are more than happy to stay in the forest and watch the world burn.
That's an interesting take on it, actually, though, because then it's
like
it's not really evil or good in any way. It's just looking out for its own self-interest.
It's kind of like the saying, like, ignorance is bliss, right? They don't really know or care too much about what happens outside, as long as what's inside is doing well, right? I don't know if that may allude to something as well in the real world.
It may possibly be influenced by something, I suppose. Like possibly the whole, I guess, because is this whole, given the fact that this was sort of written for his child, the whole nature versus nurture argument could literally be Tolkien stating that, both of these factors are important. Both of these factors can be used for good, and both of them can be used for bad. So in a sense, he's like trying to use both the ideas of nature and nurture to, I guess, teach the listeners, the readers, about the better, how to take the better side of each, rather than just simply believing in one or the other as the ultimate good or the ultimate evil. Capture?
Yeah, and then there's also the self-containment thing. It applies to things like Smog, for example. He's can't mend the armor of his scales. If the dragons had teamed up with the dwarves, then they would be unstoppable, but they're greedy, self-interesting creatures. Likewise, if everyone just worked together, Smog was pathetically weak. Like, literally, one guy of them wasn't even a magical arrow. It's just like this cool arrow his dad left him or something. Just shot the guy one thing. I feel like that's like a criticism of real life too. If our problems in real life, instead of being a vague, nebulous cosmic force that we can't directly interact with, like global warming, or pollution, if it was just a giant fire-breathing dragon that's come to burn us, we take care of it immediately. It wouldn't take, like, no one would blink. They just fire up the military and gun it down.
I think this could really actually apply very well to what's happening now with coronavirus and stuff. Like, we see it as this large giant that's overbearing and threatening, while all we have to do is sit at home and watch TV or whatever, and we can beat it. Kind of like all that was needed was the arrow.
Yeah, but then it's also the sense of, it wasn't just, it was this whole sense of working together between people that ultimately ended the dragon. Because remember, Bard wouldn't have known where to shoot, and the arrow, the cool arrow that his dad left him, almost certainly would have missed if Bilbo hadn't ended up telling the Raven about the dragon's weak spot. So it was this idea of even when separated, even when they weren't actually in the immediate vicinity of each other to help each other, they ultimately, it's like their combined effort ultimately ended up felling the dragon in a sense.
Yeah. But how much easier would the dragon have been to kill if Legolas decided to appear from Lord of the Rings and shoot him with his elven archery magical elf boostedness? Or if Gandalf helped, or if everyone made an army, or if the goblins made a war machine that could fire it, right?
Well, yeah, it would have been way easier, and then Lake Town would have been destroyed. But again, it's like this sort of you still do need to know your enemy in a sense, because even if Legolas or Gandalf had appeared and simply gunned down the dragon, they probably wouldn't have succeeded unless they had known about that one
Let's
spot.
talk about the little things, which was gotten from accident. A lot of it says that a lot of the world's up to chance, I think, is another theme in there. Especially, like, it's directly shown by Gandalf. When you don't know what to do, the wizard is plot armor and appears and saves Bilbo, and his buddies will doing spooky things in the background. Gandalf works in Gandalf works in mysterious ways.
Well, yeah, Gandalf is sort of like a plot armor piece, but again, he's also a sort of mentor piece, isn't he? Because he's like
He's
like
the
the hand. He's like the symbolism for the hand of fate guiding the party.
Yeah, he even takes the obligatory mentor death in Lord of the Rings, although he comes back.
Yeah, that was a bit for me, the whole dying and coming back thing. But that's not the Hobbit.
Well, like, to be fair, I didn't like the Lord of the Rings as much as I liked the Hobbit. Because some parts are really stretched out without them really doing anything.
That's an interesting take on it.
Well, the Hobbit, it's like the Hobbit is succinctly a ton of stories. Like, every individual area itself could have been a full story if you wanted to really develop it. Well, the Lord of the Rings is like, they're going to beat Sauron, and there's these spooky people chasing them, and Aragorn can heal people by putting herbs in water or something.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about how the Hobbit is like a bunch of like strung together stories. It's almost like you could tell each one of them as a bedtime story to your kid, kind of like how Tolkien would have probably.
Isn't that sort of what ended up happening in the Silmarillion? Kind of.
Silmarillion's not as well known, nor have I read it, so maybe.
I remember reading Silmarillion at one point, and it was basically sort of if each individual segment, each of the barely mentioned stuff in Hobbit and Lord of the Rings ended up becoming expressed as its full story. But I kind of felt that Tolkien's decision to limit all these stories that could have been to just snippets that could have only been viewed from the perspective of the Hobbit ends up contributing to this whole idea of like the common life, of how every common person's story has its own story to it, and those stories are comprised of other people's stories that are intertwined together that you take part in or you may not take part in, right? It's this whole theme of the common person.
Every person, and then you don't magically become special in order to save the world is another thing.
Yeah, it's not like he's not the only protagonist. Other people have their own stories going on at the same time. He's just a guy. He's just a guy that's just somehow got intertwined in this journey and is just rolling with it.
Yeah.
It's not like, again, with that whole theme of he's not special, he's just an ordinary person. Remember at the beginning of the story, Gandalf specifically mentioned that all the heroes with capital H, so like which were supposed to represent like conventional heroes, they were up north fighting wars and slaying dragons. But then in this region, in the absence of heroes, it was the common people that ended up rising and solving the crisis.
Competency of Bilbo is like there's a lot of highlight points. Like for the final 5% of the battle, he gets knocked out and sleeps this one out, guys, while his buddies get massacred.
Yeah.
In a conventional story with power fantasy, he would probably, I don't know, stabbed back.
He would have inherited the power of Sauron and
Who got the power of God and anime, then destroyed all his enemies.
Yeah. Just use the One Ring to end up controlling all the goblins and
By the
destroy.
way, the ring actually does act. Or like, there's also setup. You know how his great grandfather Bull Roller took whoever killed the goblin leader?
Yeah.
With the fight coming with that guy's descendant, the story obvious would have been for Bilbo to follow in the echoes of the past, but no, he doesn't. The guy gets beat by Bjorn.
Yeah, which was sort of reflected, which was I feel was reflected immediately as soon as that plot point was mentioned about Bullroarer, in the sense that was it Thorin or one of the dwarves, I think it was Thorin, basically just told him that was the past, that's not you. So it's this idea of you don't necessarily even have to follow in your ancestors' footsteps either, or this sort of idea of, oh, this is what they did, so you must do this as well, as in this sort of predetermined fate. He can just choose to be what he wants to be.
And even though Bullroarer was a very big and powerful hobbit, he's still a hobbit. It's sort of that. The interesting thing about the ordinariness of things is, even though Bullroarer, by all accounts, was an extremely extraordinary being, he was pretty ordinary compared to like the other races in terms of size and strength. Because a big hobbit is a small elf or a medium dwarf.
Yep. Do we ever get told how large the goblins are?
And
story?
it's sort of implied. Not really. They're probably not super big from what we can tell.
Yeah, I kind of figured that they were roughly about the size of the dwarves, probably.
Like there's vivid imagery, but at the same time, nothing super specific. Like there's a part where they talk about mountain giant.
Yusuf?
You can kind of tell the size by the size of the tunnels, but it's not. It's mostly implied. Like it's not explicit.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
like
fair.
later on the tunnels, it's from what I can tell, Gandalf can stand up without problem. So for all we know, they might be around human sized, but they're implied smaller because I think partially because pop culture idea of a goblin and that they're fighting dwarves and hobbits.
On the other hand, was there anything that you guys disliked about the book? That you feel that it didn't do good, or that you would have preferred another way? And why?
Honestly, like as a storybook, it works well as a storybook for children, but doesn't work as well for anything else.
Really? But weren't we just...
What I mean by that is in things like, for example, the Deus Ex Machina, the omnipotent narrator, and other things are very good story writing for the style it's trying to convey. But if you try to use it as a coherent story with inner working logic, it's not that great doing that. I'd say because, like, imagine you read a modern story where it says, by the way, the wizard guy comes back and saves them all, but then he conveniently disappears again, guys.
Yeah, that's true. The fact that the narrator is kind of omnipotent probably does reduce the tensions in the story a little bit, because immediately after any plot point is introduced, it kind of just mellows or calms the reader down.
No, they can't.
It's okay. It's all okay.
I mean, it works. It works very well. I think it works very well because it would be criticized, but because it takes such an unconventional approach, as in it's written as the style of a story that's being told to someone after it's already finished. It's a retelling of some kind of Bilbo adventure.
Yeah, it's sort of like a bard or something, I guess.
Yeah, in that case, because of that, I feel like it kind of removes its biggest flaw, that it would actually be really awkwardly as just a conventional story because of the narrator and wizard, because it's a story being told to some children. Of course, there's a narrator and a wizard.
Tolkien probably could have also just dug into the... I feel like he could have just dug into the whole illusion thing and then ended up with actual morality messages for like real life as well, if he had chosen to.
I mean, I think he has one. There's one semi-explicit one that can be
Sort
applied.
of has, but then he vehemently denies that it's an illusion.
No, it's in the one near the end. It doesn't need to do any real life messages where, like, Thorin, as he's dying, says, Bilbo, if only people valued friends, food, and laughter more than gold.
Yeah, moral of the story. Yeah, that's kind of the theme of... That's kind of ties back into the whole theme of greed, doesn't it? It's like there's this whole idea of characters that fall to greed, or characters that show signs of greed often end up having nasty things happen to them, or essentially just come home as unpleasant at the very least. Like, for example, I most people would say that Smog is the biggest example of this because he steals the dwarf's gold. He doesn't actually do anything with it. He just needs it because he's greedy for it. It's shiny and he likes shiny things. And then he just ends up using it as a bed, and then rolls around in it, and then the gold literally provides him an armor. But that armor has a weak point. It's over his heart. It's this idea that he may believe that his presumed greed and his presumed wealth that he's accumulated illicitly through his greed protects him, but then it ends up pretty much condemning him because it makes him less aware of his surroundings and then more likely to be felled by like a stray arrow, for instance.
Smog also is explicitly an example of useless because a dragon has no need for gold. He literally uses it for betting.
Yeah, as in, is this whole
There's a
idea?
direct comparison to a rich person who has no need but still gets angry because something's missing.
Yeah. In that sense,
it's like the idea of entitlement.
Yeah,
because like everyone feels like they should get the treasure.
it kind of plays like how the state of the world is, like with all of the rich people that feel untouchable, like Smog. I just don't like. Do you think you guys can expand on that idea in a way?
Just money itself isn't that useful on its own, right? There's no innate value, and Smog explicitly says that.
Yeah.
It's only its buying power that's useful, and then Smog doesn't use it for buying power, so it's literally just a pile of metal. Because he doesn't use it for anything. It doesn't have any value.
It makes a great bed sheet for him because of dragon feelings.
Yeah, that's true. That's probably true.
I guess, yeah, after a certain point, more money is not like useful. Like billionaires will never be able to spend all their money in their lifetime.
I mean,
That's true.
I suppose Smog itself also puts a great illusion because he sleeps on the piles of gold. It's the idea that incredible wealth, the only thing it really brings you is peace of mind, and that's insanely valuable, isn't it? Combined with the invincible armor. It's that I think it strikes into the sense of paranoia. It's the idea that you won't have enough. There's going to be some weakness, and you think you can cover it up by just getting more and more resources. But in some case, the idea of that failure is either so catastrophic that no amount of money will protect you, or there never was such a thing in the first place in terms of likelihood. And no matter how much wealth you get, there will always be an wound in your armor that you can't melt on your own.
All good things, I suppose, have a limit to which they're good, because obviously sometimes the more you get, it becomes more of a hindrance. Like it was a hindrance. He sort of just lives his life out in the mountain, doing nothing and just sleeping.
And if you think about it, if Smog had someone to help him, they could have possibly like filled in the gap in his armor, right? So it plays back to the what Thorin said about having friends and caring less about money and more about
Ironically,
friends and laughter.
The problem was that Thorin didn't actually believe in what he said until it was too late.
Yeah, that's why he only really said it when he died.
Yeah. Because he pretty much ended up spending his story is actually kind of sad despite his somewhat unpleasant personality. It's like he spent his entire life trying to build the dwarves up to a point where they can go back and reclaim their stolen honor, and then immediately, because of this intense greed that lost him his entire life, it's like the despondent nature of greed doesn't play favoritism. It doesn't necessarily help or hinder you despite if you're evil or good or whatever. It equally hurts all the guys. Because Thorin was arguably on the good side in this story, in the narrative structure at least. And then even he ended up basically getting screwed over by the gold because he ended up falling into dragon sickness and then incited a war, which then incited the goblins and the wargs to attack, which ultimately ended up killing him.
And if we look at the glory days, if they hadn't accumulated so much wealth, Smog probably would have never attacked. Dragon is a literal personification of greed, has come to burn them down for how much money they accumulate without use.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. It's the fact, like you mean the dwarves ended up accumulating so much that they didn't need, and then that kind of ended up bringing them their own downfall, I guess.
Because the uselessness of wealth is constantly pointed out. When you go back to the Dwarven Gold, what do you think about their great academic achievements? No, the thing they point out, one of the first things and things they focus on is the toys. Literally small trinkets used for nothing but entertainment. You don't talk about how useful it is or how well fed everyone's. You talk about how glorious it was and how cool and fancy everything was. Like the necessity is completely ignored.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I entirely agree with the point how like greed, it doesn't really differentiate between evil and good, and it equally harms them both.
I think could be an argument that there actually isn't much good or evil in Hobbit. Because although there clearly people are meant to be pleasant and people who are meant to be pleasant, like some people are mean, but very few people go out their way to cause more harm. Smaug might have been once a terrifying tyrant, but now he's so inactive that people don't even know he exists.
So you think that, like, despite the book essentially just telling you,
The
oh,
book codes, yeah, they literally tell you, but the book also doesn't show you that they're evil. The goblins might be described as warmongering murderers, but until the very end, all they do is sit in their cave and mine. They're very much a more crude dwarf in that sense. The elves might be very kind people, but none of them bother to lay a finger to help our venture except for giving them necessities because they live in such opulence.
that's an interesting take on it. It's like basically the whole thing about the narrator explicitly telling people that, oh, they're good or they're evil. It's actually supposed to function as an antithesis.
I would say that's kind of a way to reflect how people perceive good and evil rather than the actual good or evil of things. We assume they're good or evil because they're traits that we think are gross or bad or mean. But nothing about that's innately horrible. Greed is not bad.
It's
just
more
greed.
different.
Childishness is not good. It's just childish.
Yeah, that actually that's actually a really good point, because then it's the whole idea that the narrator is also a person. The narrator is a storyteller, and he has its own biases. And just like any other human or any other person, he believes he has a certain worldview where he believes that some people are friends, some people are foes, some people are good, some people are evil. And then that simplistic mindset is sort of dissuaded by the fact that they're never actually shown as doing anything particularly evil, but rather simply just acting in their own self-interest. Like, even Bilbo, in a sense, could be said to be acting in his own self-interest, because he just wants to get out of this alive, man.
And although good food and friends seems like what's called a very good thing, if you look at the hobbits, they're shown as lazy and incredibly over useful of what's it called resources. They eat way too much. They sleep very long times in their days, and they spend their times doing nothing.
And even the hobbits have greed, because remember, like, at the end of the book, wasn't there something about the other hobbits?
All his neighbors got angry and wanted to take his money and auction off his stuff.
Yeah, even the people who are supposedly good and enjoy good food and peace and prosperity, even they have policies to greed.
The fault of the greed is the very beginning. The hobbits are described as very wealthy folk. It's just what they use their greed for happens to be food.
In that sense, couldn't they be sort of considered like a leisure class people? It's like they're not actually out there they're not actually out there and seeing what's happening, but then they sort of just believe from the comfort of their own homes that, oh, everything's fine.
Yeah, and there's also the idea that they don't want to go on adventures. Most of them don't earn their wealth through what's it called, active hard work, or through other means. In fact, they frown upon people who take risks or do make change.
Yeah. I think that's it for this podcast. We've talked a lot.
That's all for today, folks. We don't have an outro. The outro is just whatever random fact we have for the day.
Hey, what's a random fact that we have for today, Jesse?
What's a good random fact that's vaguely Hobbit related?
I have very good.
You can
You have a
kill
very good
two adult humans with the vitamin A from a polar bear liver. Don't eat polar bear livers like Hobbit's kids. Or we could also say, you know, in real life, humans are resistant to non-lateral poisons. If you put to a fancy setting, well, that means that elves will probably get sick from a lot of things that we eat, and vice versa.
Yeah, that makes sense, given that they're different species and everything, and also are used to certain types of food.
You could call that food for thought. Okay, now end the recording. Laugh or you die. Cut the clip. Cut the recording. recording, guys.
Well, wait, did you know that manatees go to the surface of the water every 3 to 5 minutes to breathe, although they can remain underwater for longer, holding their breath for up to 20 minutes? When they do take a breath, 90% of the air in their lungs is replaced. Whereas for humans, we tend to replace about 10%.
That's a fun fact.
That's our fun fact.
All right, that's it. Goodbye.